Please, please. You know, Robert, you might not believe this, but I've been following your campaign very closely in Coatbridge West. And I'll tell you what, I mean, such as your introduction, that I promise that I'll be pausing by Coatbridge for a refreshment during the campaign period over the next few weeks. Well done to you, Robert, and good luck with your campaign. Tasmina, Chair, friends, we meet in Glasgow in the shadow of war in Europe. In the best traditions of the national movement in Scotland, we condemn the illegal invasion, we stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, and we urge greater efforts to help those displaced and suffering from the conflict. Our national movement has two other characteristics which we also stand behind. Firstly, we condemn all illegal invasions, regardless of the perpetrator. That's been our stance since Vietnam, has continued through Palestine, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Iraq. And secondly, our movement urges reconciliation, peace, diplomacy, de-escalation, not escalation. Some people say that's idealistic. It is, but it's also practical. You don't end suffering by urging more war, and you don't end war by risking nuclear annihilation. And that's the reality of the events, the tragic events in Ukraine. Now, in its political form, that national movement in Scotland is approaching a century old. In contrast, our Alba party has just reached our first birthday. And looking at the strength and the commitment of this spring conference, the excellent chairing, the enthusiasm of the delegates, the wide range of motions, the first fraternal address from a trade union leader in the history of the Alba party, Gordon. We are in fine, rude health. You know, people said we wouldn't last a month. Nobody would be interested. Now we're 6,700 strong, and there's 100 of us and more will carry the party banner into the elections in 6 weeks' time. So will Robert and the rest of our party candidates standing in May please stand up so you can get a round of applause from all the delegates. Now, these are diverse candidates, women and men, representing the best and, crucially, all of Scotland. And they're brought together to be the spearhead of our campaign by key beliefs. We believe in the urgent necessity of independence for our country. We believe that ordinary Scottish families must be properly protected from the most savage squeeze in living standards for the last half-century. And we believe that the search for equality should not jeopardise the hard-won rights of women to single-sex spaces. And our core belief, independence for our country, not as an aspiration for the future, not something for the hereafter, but something for the here and now. You know, delegates, one thing I thought I would never see. I never thought I'd see a BBC presenter hounding a Scottish First Minister about when she would hold an independence referendum. And yet, that's exactly what happened with Nicola Sturgeon and Sophie Raworth earlier this year. Painfully, and for any real independence supporter, it was painful. The BBC's Sophie Raworth went through the occasion since 2014 when the SNP have promised an independence referendum and then failed to deliver. There have been 5 national elections in Scotland since the first independence referendum. In each of them, the parties of independence have won a majority of seats. In last year's Scottish election, it was both a majority of seats and, thanks to Alba's small contribution, a majority of votes as well. And in all that time, in all these mandates, nothing has happened. There's been absolutely no doing. Now, delegates, there was an old miners' leader in Scotland called Abe Moffat. Before my time, therefore before the time of just about everybody in this hall, and Abe was, along with his brother, was a key leader of the National Union of Mine Workers in Scotland, before Mick Magahey. And Abe was famous that during industrial relations with the coal board, the press would be anxiously waiting outside the hotel to see if there had been a breakthrough. And in deadlock negotiations, Abe used to summarize it by saying, "There's nought doing. There's naething doing." Well, there's been naething doing on independence over these last 8 years. This is Lucozade, incidentally. Other glucose drinks are available. I'm old enough to remember Ferguson. So now doing on independence over 8 years. Of course, there's always been a reason. Brexit, the pandemic, war in Europe, these are all mighty and important things. But none of these things have been allowed to stop the democratic test of elections, nor should they have. Why then should they stop the democratic imperative or a referendum or any other electoral test on Scottish independence? And that's why we've finally reached this ridiculous position of the BBC baiting the First Minister as to when the SNP will fulfil its contract with the people. In my time as First Minister, the BBC were always suggesting I was obsessed with independence. Now they're demanding to know when the SNP is finally going to get on with it. Well, I think Alba can answer the question as to how best to get on with the process of democracy and independence for Scotland. Two things are necessary to make and win the independence case. And in both of these, the work of Alba is instrumental. First, the case, the argument has to be refurbished for the modern age. The world has changed since 2014. And that's why we've released today the Wee Alba book to answer the questions on Europe, on currency, borders, finance, questions which the people are thirsting for answers. This, the Wee Alba book. Not just the Wee Alba book, of which delegates here get 2 copies, but the special conference edition. Now, given there's 100,000 of these books, I cannot claim that they're going to command a huge price on eBay, because 100,000 is a substantial number, and that's only the first edition. I'd merely suggest that the special conference edition of 1,000 may be a different matter entirely. So make sure you didn't get cheated as you leave your hall and get your Wee Alba book. The second copy, incidentally, is for you to sign up another Alba member. This is not an Alba manifesto. It deals with a subject which is too important for the confines of one political party's policy. It's a common sense conversation on the fundamentals of the independence case. If the SNP had been serious about independence, they would have been serious about the issues in this book. That's the reason why Alba is necessary. Indeed, it's 100,000 reasons why Alba is necessary. One each for every copy of the first edition of this book. And as I say, that's just the first edition. I saw a topical motion on the agenda today instructing the NEC to launch a fundraiser for the next edition. Let me just mention in Alba, every penny of the fundraiser will go to advancing the cause of independence and nowhere else. And then secondly, there's the independence campaign itself. For 7 long years, the SNP have been refusing to face the music of what to do when Westminster says no. Well, the answer is you devise a campaign to bend Westminster to the will of the Scottish people, a campaign of popular demonstration, of political action, of legal initiatives, of diplomatic moves. It is exactly the strategy that Alba laid out in the very first debate at our very first conference led by Kenny McCaskill MP. After the 2011 election, we faced down David Cameron and George Osborne. Are we really saying that Scotland can't face down Boris Johnson? The Prime Minister was talking about me last week. He said he wanted me to send me into space. Well, let me tell him, his line of trajectory is downwards, not upwards. Boris Johnson doesn't even command the confidence of the Scottish Tory leader, the ridiculous Douglas Ross. We're at Hampden Park. Douglas Ross is the first referee to rescind a red card without the benefit of VAR. Boris Johnson, living proof that the road to hell is paved with bad intentions. Now, as we explain in the Wee Alba book, the case for independence stands on its own merits, the right of a nation to self-determination. But getting rid once and for all of the Johnson Tory gang is certainly an added incentive. Alba says that the new campaign for Scotland's claim of right starts immediately after the local elections through the idea of a convention of the elected members of Scotland. And it's exactly why Alba's success in these elections is a prerequisite for independence progress for Scotland. And that brings me exactly to these coming elections. Here's 3 questions. They're important questions, because I defy anyone to find the answer to these questions and then not be converted to the independence cause. In this energy-rich Scotland of ours, we produce all of the electricity we need from renewable sources already, and we're several times self-sufficient in natural gas. So the questions are these. Why exactly are our electricity bills up 50% already, with the same again to come in the autumn? Why are heating costs sky high and dictated by the marginal price of world gas? And why are we facing huge amounts of fuel poverty in energy plenty Scotland? And the answer, and this is the answer we must broadcast and take to every household and business in Scotland, is because we allow our vast resources, which by rights belong to the people, to be controlled by a pernicious combination of Westminster government and international capital. Well, no more. No more. So instead of closing down the North Sea, as bizarrely advocated by the SNP Green government, Alba say, let's make every consented field invest in carbon capture as a condition of licence approval. Let's manage our resource in a way compatible with the future of our planet. And instead of the great billion-pound giveaway to foreign capital of our offshore wind licences, which Kenny McCaskill expanded on this morning, which in time these wind licenses could produce up to 5 times, perhaps even 10 times our own electricity needs, then let's take a public share in every single field. Let Scotland do with renewables in this century what the Norwegians did with oil in the last century. Let's make renewable energy in Scotland the people's energy. Delegates, I'm told that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is sensitive about his height, or lack of it. Apparently, the Prime Minister deliberately appoints tall junior Treasury ministers to make his own Chancellor feel inferior. Such are the petty rivalries of the Tory party. I think they call them Jolly Japes. But let me say to Rishi Sunak, it is not your stature you need to worry about. It's the tiny scale of your ambition and your budget to tackle the massive problems now facing working people. People are facing sky-high energy and food costs. Average fuel bills are heading to 2,000. That's about 1/4 already of the average state pension. Soon they'll be at 3,000, and many households will be forced to devote 20% or more of their entire income to heating their home. Small business, farmers, fishermen are all facing crippling increase in fuel costs. And what does the Chancellor do in response? He produces a mouse when people are confronting an elephant in their living rooms and offices. He fiddles around at the edges with council tax. He takes 5p off petrol when prices at the pumps are up 5 times that already. He allows energy companies to waltz off with £20 billion in windfall profits while people shiver in their homes. In contrast, Alba puts forward a serious 5-point plan to tackle child, family and pensioner poverty in Scotland. A plan which would make a real difference to the lives of working people across our country. That's what our candidates are asking people to vote for in this election. It would cost in total around 3% of the Scottish Government's revenue budget and is well affordable. What it requires is the political will to deliver it. What's political will? It's the essence of saying something can be done when the government advisors say it can't. It's the political will that 10 years ago restored free education, removed prescription charges and bridge tolls and froze the council tax. That's the will which is required. When the SNP in 2007 went in with that manifesto, do you think the civil service said, well, that's absolutely ideal, we'll just get on with we're removing tuition charges from Scotland? On the contrary, it was, we don't know if that's affordable. The difference was political will. And with political will, the Alba's 5-point plan to tackle child and family poverty in Scotland could be delivered. So you can contrast the scale of that ambition for Scotland with the tiny proposals of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. There he was at the dispatch box in the House of Commons with plenty of room in his budget forecasts, and he produced the square root of nothing. It's not just heartless, it's economically illiterate. Because unless he acts now to get inflation out of the system, then we're heading for sky-high interest rates and a full-blown recession. In contrast, if he had provided the funds to reduce council tax across these islands by, let's say, 1/4, it would have cost $10 billion a year, but it would have taken the retail price index down by 1%. If he'd stopped energy costs rising by 50%, it would have cost another $10 billion a year, but it would have taken another 1% off the retail price index and could have been financed by a windfall tax. But the point is this: every time the retail price index goes up, the RPI, so does the interest payments on £500 billion of borrowing of index-linked gilts to financiers. So 1% onto the RPI puts $5 billion onto interest payments. But equally, 1% off the RPI takes $5 billion off the bill. Thus, the Chancellor had the ability this week to act seriously on energy costs and council tax, finance it from a windfall tax, and $10 billion of savings on debt interest payments. He had it within his power to make a real difference to family budget this year of £1,000 or more to show us the will and the heart to protect people from economic fear. But as this week's lamentable performance demonstrated, he would rather dole out the cash and additional interest payments to his pals in the city. Rishi gives to the rich. The Tories look after their own. Plus sa chance. There is a further reason why Scotland needs Alba now. As First Minister, I pursued a strategy which sought to persuade people to independence on the basis of good governance of the devolved Parliament. Our unionist opponents were frightened of it. In fact, they were terrified by it. You may remember Lord George Foulkes once whined on the radio that the Scottish Government were creating a position where services in Scotland were manifestly better than they were south of the border. When the bemused interviewer said, "But isn't that what they're meant to be doing?" Foulkes replied, "Yes, but they are doing it deliberately." He was right. We were doing it deliberately. I wanted to create a situation where even the most hostile critic of independence, like Lord George Foulkes, was forced to concede the competence of the Scottish Government. Now we've moved to a position where even the most ardent supporter of independence know that the SNP Green administration is becoming both incompetent and accident-prone. Key statistic on the economy is not so much the unemployment rate, because that can hide underemployment and poor wages and part-time employment. The key statistic is the employment rate. For generations, this key figure lagged in Scotland behind the UK average. Then Scotland overtook the UK, and in the years up to 2014, we opened up a gap, totally confounding the doommongers in Project Fear, as employment in Scotland increased as we approached the referendum. Now, unfortunately, we lag the UK once again. Our education and health service have both suffered grievously from the pandemic, despite the heroics of the staff, but both were struggling, as we know, before the pandemic started. We're still in the grip of a deadly virus, where last week's 1 in 11 Scots were infected. But the public health monitoring of it is effectively coming to an end. From the 18th of April, free lateral flow tests will no longer be available to the general population. It will be the first pandemic in history apparently brought to a conclusion by the simple expedient of ceasing to count the cases. We invented public health policy in Scotland. The pandemic has shown just how far our capability has sunk. And then, as we've heard, there's the ferries fiasco. When you bring together one of Scotland's greatest industrialists with a track record of success, and join that with a fine shipyard workforce at Ferguson's, then that should work. If it doesn't, then it should tell you something about how the ships are being commissioned. Just like the constant design changes caused so much chaos in the building of the Scottish Parliament all these years ago. And who's responsible for this madness? Well, according to SNP special advisors, it's anyone who's no longer around to defend themselves. The Scottish Government have gone from being able to build the greatest civil engineering project in Scottish history, the Fourth Crossing, within 10 weeks of schedule and £245 million under budget, to not being able to supply our island communities with ferries. I've heard it said that the Green Party were ushered in the door of government with no reference to the Scottish people. Then that day, common sense went out the window. In fairness, there were problems developing with competence long before that. The key point is this: we mustn't lose the people to independence because the current administration has lost its way. We mustn't have people turning back to the tired old unionist parties who've got nothing to offer our people, or worse still, staying at home and not voting at all. Delegates, we meet as a party on the onus and verge of elections. I'm looking forward as your leader, a privilege that I have to get round campaigning with as many of the candidates as possible. And yes, you've solidified that today with your kind introduction, Robert. Our party leadership will be engaged in the campaign trail, and we do it because we know it's vital to Scotland that Alba makes progress. We'll be holding town hall meetings, the length and breadth for the country, with the wee Alba book. We haven't had much opportunity for town hall meetings these last year for very obvious reasons. We'll be taking every chance to hold a meeting, not just in this election campaign, but throughout this coming year. Thanks to the work of Denise Finlay, many of these meetings have already been arranged. For example, I've agreed to do a meeting at the invitation of Lisa Keogh in Arbroath on the 6th of April. You'll recognise the symbolism of that date. As you remember the Arbroath Declaration, it said, among other things, that as long as 100 of us remain alive, then we keep the flame of independence burning strong. Well, we have more than 100 candidates in this election. Let's go forth from this, our national stadium, and set this nation alight. Thank you very much.